so that you'll see that my interpretation of the Quran is not my interpretation. It happens to be the interpretation of the first 3 generations of Muslims. In fact, I'm not just debating a Muslim tonight, I'm debating a particular Muslim, a Salafi Muslim. And as a Salafi, he is obligated to implement the Quran as understood and practiced by the first 3 generations of Muslims. For example, in Sahih Bukhari, this is what his prophet is reported to have said. The prophet was asked, "Who are the best people?" He replied, "The people of my generation, and those who follow after me, and those who follow after them." So the first 3 generations of Muslims happen to be the best generations of Islam. So if I want to know how to implement chapter 4 of the Quran or chapter 9 of the Quran, I don't turn to Nadir and I don't turn to myself. I turn to them. In fact, this is what Muhammad said of Umar ibn al-Khattab, because he's going to be very important tonight. I'm going to look at the example of Umar, the 3rd caliph, a companion of Muhammad and his father-in-law, to see how he understood and implemented chapter 9 of the Quran, which happens to be one of the last chapters of the Quran that was composed by Muhammad. Now, my opponent believes it was revealed. I doubt that, and I don't believe that. If that was the case, I'd be a Muslim. This is one of the last chapters of the Quran that was composed, and these are Muhammad's final marching orders. This is what he says about Umar. This is what he says about following the sunnah of the caliphs, including Umar. The Messenger of Allah gave us a sermon by which our hearts were filled. And then he says, "Verily among you, you'll see great controversy. So you must keep to my sunnah and the sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs," which includes Umar. So tonight, I'm going to base my interpretation of the Quran on Muhammad and his companions and those who followed after them, so that I won't be accused of false interpretation. One thing to remember in this debate, when you're debating the topic of Islam being a religion of peace, you must examine the life of Muhammad and how he dealt with the disbelievers depending on his circumstances and situation. For example, in chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran, it says, "You have a good example in God's messenger, whoever hopes for God and the last day." Which means that if you're a Muslim, you must see how Muhammad treated the disbelievers depending on the situation and the circumstances. What my opponent did tonight, he focused on those verses that were composed during the 2nd stage of Muhammad's dealing with disbelievers. In order for you to understand my point, there are 3 stages in Muhammad's development and attitude towards the disbelievers. Stage 1, when Muhammad is in Mecca and surrounded by disbelievers and he doesn't have the resources or the manpower to fight back, even though he instigated the hostilities with them, he preaches a message of tolerance, of peace. For example, chapter 109 of the Quran says, "Say, O unbelievers, I serve not what you serve, and you're not serving what I serve, nor am I serving what you have served, neither are you serving what I serve. To you your religion, and to me mine. You don't want to believe? Fine, go ahead, you're free in the matter." Now that's stage 1. Now what happens in stage 2? Shortly after that, Muhammad migrates to Medina, and he has the backing of several tribes, and coincidentally, during this time when he has the backing of tribes and he has soldiers who are willing to fight for him, he now implements self-defense, which was what my opponent was focusing on for most of his debate speech. That, see, we fight oppression, those who oppress us. Yes, that's stage 2 in Muhammad's development. And stage 2 includes such passages as chapter 2, verses 190 to 194, and chapter 22, verses 39 to 41. Now, I don't need to read these passages because he pretty much took care of that. But what about stage 3? After Muhammad conquers Mecca and subjugates the Arabian tribes, he now implements offensive jihad. Not just jihad done in self-defense or to fight oppression, but jihad done with the purpose of subjugating everyone to the rule of Islam. Now let me read those verses. Chapter 9, verses 28 to 31. And pay careful attention to what the text says and what it does not say. And then I'm going to show you how Umar implemented chapter 9, verse 29. But for the context, verses 28 to 31. O believers, the associators, those who associate with Allah, are indeed unclean. They're unclean. So let them not come near the holy mosque after this year of theirs. And by the way, do not forget the historical setting of this passage. This was supposedly revealed after Muhammad had conquered Mecca and the pagans were forced to subjugate to his rule. Now he's not satisfied with them remaining in their paganism. Now they must be expelled, otherwise become Muslim. If you fear poverty, God shall surely enrich you of His bounty, if He will. God is all-knowing, all-wise. Now note, verse 29. These are one of the final orders of Muhammad given to his community. And we're going to see how Umar implemented these orders. Fight those, not who oppress you. That's not what the text says. Fight those who attack you. That's not what it says. Fight those who believe not in God and the last day, and do not forbid what God and His messenger have forbidden. So the grounds for fighting them is not because they oppressed you. It's not because they attacked you. It's because they don't believe what you believe. Okay, let me continue. Such men as practice not the religion of truth. And again, according to the Quran, the religion of truth is Islam. Being of those who have been given the book until they pay jizya out of hand and have been humbled. Now let's see how Umar implemented this text. Now note what my opponent said earlier. Either I was going to interpret the text on the basis of false assumption or my ignorance. Well, I'm going to let Umar interpret the text, and then he's going to have to apply that criteria to his caliph. Maybe he was ignorant, or he was operating under the false assumption that this passage mandated offensive jihad. Let's see. This is from Ibn Kathir. This honorable ayah, now note the composition of this passage, was revealed with the people of the book after the pagans were defeated. Note, he subjugated the Arabs, those who were idolaters. The people entered Allah's religion in large numbers, and the Arabian Peninsula was secured under the Muslims' control. Do you see when he implements this passage? When he has enough manpower and resources to spread Islam by the sword offensively. So this is stage 3. Now let's read on what he says about Umar's application of this passage. The subheading of Ibn Kathir is quite telling. Paying jizya is a sign of kufr and disgrace. So why do Christians and Jews pay this jizya? As a sign that they've been humiliated and disgraced because of Islam. This is not me saying it. These are his scholars saying this. And this is what he goes on to say. With willing submission, in defeat and subservience, and feel themselves subdued, meaning disgraced, humiliated, and belittled. That sure sounds like Islam is a religion of peace. Therefore, Muslims are not allowed to honor the people of Dhimma, meaning the Jews and Christians who've been subjugated to the rule of Islam, or elevate them above Muslims, for they are miserable. This is his scholar. And interestingly, when Ibn Kathir writes this, he's writing this when Islam is dominant. So he doesn't have to hide the true face of Islam, unlike my opponent tonight. Right? They are miserable, disgraced, and humiliated. Muslim, Sahih Muslim, recorded from Abu Huraira. Now who's Abu Huraira? The first generation of Muslims. Muhammad's companion. That the Prophet said, do not initiate the salam, the peace, to the Jews and Christians. If you meet any of them in the road, force them to the narrowest alley. So if a Jew happens to walk by a Muslim and Islam is dominant, Muhammad gives them the right to push them off the road. And this is the religion of peace. This is why the leader of the faithful, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and it says, may Allah be pleased with him, demanded his well-known conditions. Note, this is not a choice he gave the Christians. This is a demand that they must meet, or they're going to have to fight. And if they win, then they keep their property or be killed, and their women and children taken as captives. Demanded upon the Christians these conditions that ensured their continued humiliation, degradation, and disgrace. Do you see now why jizya is implemented? Do you see what Muhammad's companions did with this passage? And why they implemented the jizya? To humiliate Jews and Christians who were living under the rules. Now let's look at some of the conditions that the religion of peace mandates of Jews and Christians to observe and follow. Let's look at some of the conditions. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. This is a document to the servant of Allah, Umar, the leader of the faithful, from Christians from such and such city. Look at the conditions he imposed. We made a condition on ourselves that we will neither erect in our areas a monastery, right, or a church or a sanctuary for a month, nor restore any place of worship that needs restoration. You can't even rebuild a church that's decaying under the rule of Islam, provided Muslims are at stage 3. Right now, Muslims are in stage 2 and stage 1, respectively. Let's continue. We will not prevent any Muslim from resting in our churches, whether they come by the day or night. We'll open our doors to them. Those Muslims who come as guests, we will enjoy boarding and food for them. We'll give them food. We will not teach our children the Quran. In other words, to protect our kids, why you shouldn't believe in the Quran? You have no right to teach the Quran in the privacy of your homes under Islamic rule if you're a Christian or a Jew. And we cannot publicize practices of shirk. In other words, if we have slogans saying that Jesus is Son of God, that's shirk. You can't publicize that. Invite anyone to shirk. So if I want to invite you, a Muslim, to Christ as Lord and Savior, I am forbidden to do so by Umar, one of the caliphs that Muhammad said, follow his sunnah. This is not an ignorant. This is a Muslim companion of Muhammad who was faithfully implementing the orders of his prophet. And then it goes on to say, we will respect Muslims, move from our places where we sit if they choose to sit in them. We will not imitate their clothing. We will not even hang swords on our shoulders, collect weapons of any kind, or carry these weapons. In other words, Christians don't even have a right to defend themselves. Now, he said that the Quran says that it's an obligation of Muslims to fight oppressors. Then who are fighting the Muslim oppressors of the Christians who deliver them from the oppression of Islam? I'd like him to tell me. We will have the front of our hair cut, refrain from erecting crosses, and then it concludes. When I gave this document to Umar, not to Sam Shamoun or Robert Spencer, he added to it, we will not beat any Muslim. These are the conditions that we set against ourselves and followers of our religion in return for safety and protection. This is what you demanded. If we didn't meet your demands, you would punish us, kill us, and enslave our women and children. So we meet these demands and we ask for safety and protection. See, this is stage 3. When Muslims have the upper hand, these are the verses that they will be implementing and imposing the rule of Islam upon everyone. Now, if you're a Jew and Christian, you have the quote-unquote privilege of living under Islamic rule, provided you pay the jizya as a sign of humiliation and degradation. That's according to the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29. That's according to Muhammad and Umar ibn al-Khattab, his companion. But it gets better or worse, depending on what side of the debate you're on. This is what Muhammad said to treat Jews and Christians under your rule. Abu Basra al-Ghifari reported that the Prophet said, I will write to the Jews tomorrow, do not give them the greeting first. If they greet you, then say on you. Then, Abu Hurairah reported, the Prophet said, do not give the people of the book the greeting first, force them to the narrowest part of the road. And this is from Al-Bukhari. This is not my interpretation or my thought. These are the words of his own scholars, of his own prophet, of his own caliphs. Now let's see what Salafi scholars say about offensive jihad. He was talking about jihad in the context of fighting oppression. In other words, self-defense. Here's what his own scholars say about Muslims such as himself who deny offensive jihad. Jihad done by Muslims who take the initiative to subjugate even those who have not harmed or fought or oppressed Muslims. This is what they say. Physical jihad is the pinnacle of Islam. And some scholars regard it as the sixth Islam. One of the strangest things to note is that we are living in a time when some of the Muslims are embarrassed to quote the verses and ahadith on jihad in front of their kafir friends, disbelievers. So Nadir is embarrassed to quote these verses and their historical context. I don't blame him. I would be embarrassed too. Their faces turn red because they are too shy to mention the rulings on the jizya, on slavery, and killing prisoners of war. They wish that they could erase these verses and ahadith from the Quran and Sunnah so that they would not be criticized by this world with its backward principles despite its claims to be civilized. If they cannot erase these passages, they try to misinterpret them and distort their meanings so that they can suit the whims and desires of their masters. Did you catch that? These are Salafi Muslims saying that there are some Muslims who are living in the midst of unbelievers and are ashamed to speak the truth about Islam and its agenda to subjugate the world to Allah and His Messenger. Well, if you're ashamed, then why are you a Muslim? If you can't mention these passages and quote them in their historical context and see how your Prophet and his companions implement them, and you're that ashamed, then why are you a Muslim? Why are you still trying to defend a religion that you're too ashamed to admit its true agenda? Let's go on and see what it says. And look at the verses. It can be offensive in nature. Taking the initiative in fighting. This means pursuing the kafirs, the unbelievers in their lands. It doesn't say pursue the kafirs who pursued you. Pursue the unbelievers who attack you. Pursue them in their own lands. And fighting them if they do not agree to the rule of Islam. Note what they did not say. They did not say fight them until they give up oppression. Until they give up attacking Muslims. It says until they accept the rule of Islam. And if they don't, fight them. This is clearly from the Quran. And they quote his prophet. Remember he said, be careful of false interpretations? Well, I'm going to quote what they quote from his prophet. It was narrated from Ibn Umar. The Messenger of Allah said, I have been commanded to fight the people until they bear witness that there's no God but Allah. Did he say, I am commanded to fight the people until there's no oppression? Did he say, I'm commanded to fight the people until no one is attacked because of their religious beliefs? Or was the command to fight people until they say there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is his messenger? In other words, accept Islam. And establish regular prayer and pay zakat. And if they do that, then their blood and wealth is safe from me, except by the laws of Islam, and their reckoning will be with Allah. Again, they say, all of these texts and many others in the Quran and the Sunnah mean that it is obligatory for the Muslims to wage war against the kuffar and take the initiative. Don't wait until they oppress someone. You take the initiative to subjugate them to the rule of Islam. These are his sources, his scholars, not mine. Let me read some more of what the Muslims say about chapter 9 specifically, because he mentioned about chapter 9, and that chapter 9 doesn't contradict chapter 4, it only explains it further. On the contrary, he mentioned chapter 9 verse 5, but again he failed you to give you the historical context. Chapter 9 verse 5 was composed long after the pagans had already submitted to Muhammad. He read a part of 5 and a part of 6, but he didn't give you the entire context. Chapter 9 verse 5 is discussing what Muhammad did next after he subjugated the pagans of Mecca in Arabia. He was not satisfied keeping them in their religion. He had to force them to become Muslim, and he broke the peace treaties with them, not the other way around. That's what his scholars say, not me. Again, Ibn Kathir. This honorable ayah, chapter 9 verse 5, is called the ayah of the sword, about which Ad-Dahak bin Muzahim said, it abrogated. This is not Robert Spencer or David Horowitz or Sam Shamoun. This is a Muslim. It abrogated every agreement of peace between the Prophet and every treaty and every term. So this verse gave Muhammad the right to break the treaties he had with the pagans and force them to become Muslim or be put. That's the context of chapter 9. That's what he didn't want you to know. Again, lest he says this is Ibn Kathir, let me quote Ibn Juzay. See, I'm quoting his scholars. It doesn't have me. He has a problem with them. So he shouldn't be attacking me. He should attack Juzay and say, well, you know what? He was false assumptions. You see? If we apply his law. Ibn Juzay said, kill the mushrikeen wherever you find them, abrogating every peace treaty in the Quran. It is quite interesting to establish that Islam only fights those who oppress Muslims, but these scholars understood that verse to mean that Muhammad canceled peace with every idolater, and now the choice they had was to become Muslim. Isn't it amazing? This way, but his own scholars and his own prophet and his companions interpreted a different way altogether. Now, why would he do that? I'll get to that in a minute, why he would do this. Again, Ibn Juzay is not alone. Here's As-Suyuti, another Sunni commentator. This verse, chapter 9, verse 5, is the ayat of the sword, which abrogates, cancels out the pardon, the truces, and overlooking. Ash-Shafi took this as a proof for killing anyone who abandons the prayer. Just abandoning the religion. You abandon the prayer, and that's to kill you, according to Surah 9, verses 5 and 6. You see how they're interpreting these passages again? Now, why would they be so upfront and bold? Because when these commentators were written, Islam was the dominant force in the land. So they could be upfront and not hide or conceal anything. But my friend is in a different situation tonight. He knows that he's living in the land of unbelievers. And because he lives in the land of unbelievers, he can hide the true face of Islam, because the Quran and his Prophet and his sources say that he can conceal the true agenda of Islam and Muhammad, and it's okay with Allah. Let me read it. Let me give you the verse itself and the commentaries, so you know that I'm not making this up. Chapter 3, verse 28. When Islam is dominant, when Islam has the upper hand, Muslims are not to befriend the disbelievers. But in the case that Muslims are surrounded by unbelievers and the Muslims do not have the power to subjugate them, the Quran gives them an exception. It says you can befriend them outwardly. Here it goes, chapter 3, verse 28. Let not the believers take disbelievers for their friends in preference to believers. Whoso does that has no connection with Allah unless, here's the condition, he that wants to guard himself against them, taking as it were security. Now let me read the interpretation of this text. Ibn Kathir, quoting Abu Darda, this is what he says. Unless you indeed fear a danger from them, meaning except those believers who in some areas or times fear for their safety from the disbelievers. In this case, such believers are allowed to show friendship to disbelievers outwardly, but never inwardly. For instance, Al-Bukhari, this is the man who narrations according to Sunni Muslims. Al-Bukhari recorded that Abu ad-Darda, who was a companion of Muhammad, the first generation, the ones that Muhammad said were the best implementing Islam. He says, we smile in the face of some people like he did, smiling in your faces, although in our hearts we curse them. You guys catch that? A companion of Muhammad. Smile in your faces, but we curse them in our hearts. All right, we got 3 minutes. Okay, now let me go. Now, he may say, well, no, this is in the case that Muslims fear for their safety. If you read Islamic history, and I'm going to prove it in my rebuttal periods, the ones who started the hostilities were not the unbelievers. This is his selective citing of Islamic sources. I have Al-Tabari, Ibn Ishaq, and others saying that when Muhammad preached the unity of God, the pagans had no problems with him. Do you know when they started having problems with him? When he started attacking their gods and deriding their family values and traditions, then they had a problem. And they begged him to stop. And he wouldn't stop. Now what would you do in a situation like that? But see, to the Muslims, it's okay what Muhammad does, as long as you don't do it in kind to him. Because after all, he's the prophet, which begs the question. But let me read what his Salafi scholar says about this concealment known as tuqya or taqiyya. This is a Salafi scholar saying this. No. This verse explains all the verses quoted above which forbid. Note, when Islam is dominant, they are forbidden to befriend Jews and Christians. They are to subjugate them. Taking the kafirs, the disbelievers, as friends in general terms. What that refers to is in cases where one has a choice. But in cases of fear and taqiyya, it is permissible to make friends with them as much as is essential to protect oneself against their evil. So we are evil by nature, so we can do anything to protect against you evil people. And then Sheikh Muhammad al-Sali al-Uthaymeen, a Salafi scholar, because he's a Salafi, this is what his scholars say. Undoubtedly, the Muslim is obligated to hate the enemies of Allah. It's an obligation for you Muslims. It's not an option. You must hate the unbelievers and to disavow them, because this is the way of the messengers and their followers. But, so now tuqiyya is not just for fear, if you're afraid. You can actually use deception to convert people to Islam. So there are two reasons for this concealment. To protect the true face of Islam from the unbelievers, lest they know the agenda of Muslims. And also to deceive them into becoming Muslims. This is what he says. But if a Muslim treats them with kindness and gentleness, in the hope that they will become Muslim and will believe, there's nothing wrong with that. And it comes under the heading of opening their hearts. So it's okay. Pretend you like them. Smile in their faces to get them in Islam. Because once you come in, there ain't no coming out without your head. But if he despairs of them becoming Muslim, then he should treat them accordingly. Now, since my time is almost up, I want him to address the sources from authentic Islamic source material. I did not quote my opinion. I quoted Muhammad, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abu Darda, Abu Huraira, and his Salafi scholars. So if he says I was misinterpreting them, then blame his prophet and his companions, because I'm just going by their interpretation, not mine. So using his criteria, either they had false assumptions or they were simply ignorant about Islam. To think